Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce today's webinar. This is the webinar organized by the CEPR RPN on competition policy. I am particularly grateful to CEPR, of course, and in particular to Elise Chrétien and Lydia Williams for making this happen. So this RPN, that's an acronym for Research Policy Network, is a platform for the critical discussion of competition policy. RPM has created a sort of network of academics and enforcers to evaluate both influential decisions which have been taken by enforcers, but also ongoing academic research. In academia, we say that we strive for impact, and here is our attempt. We are asking ourselves, really, is what we do in academia relevant? Yes, no, and if not, why? So we need to confront ourselves with the enforcers and the policymakers. And we really hope this is a useful discussion both ways, so the policymakers get to know what we're doing, and we listen from them what is actually, actionable of what we do in academia. Today, in particular, we're going to talk about conglomerate mergers, specifically in the context of digital platforms. Just to give you an example, and you will hear many more in a minute, take, for instance, Amazon. Amazon recently is willing to pay almost $2 billion for the acquisition of iRobot, which is the maker of Roomba, this smart vacuum cleaner. And why should anyone care about a large e-retailer buying a smart vacuum cleaner manufacturer, apart from, maybe from iRobot's shareholders? Well, the traditional approach in antitrust would be to define some relevant market. In this case, would be the manufacturing of smart vacuum cleaners. And then the enforcers would look at the emerging parties' market shares. Probably they would find that iRobot has a strong position in this particular very narrow market of smart vacuum cleaners. However, Amazon would have almost a zero market share in such a market. So it has, of course, Amazon a very strong position, but somewhere else, downstream at the retail level, in adjacent markets for maybe smart home products such as speakers, etc. But the competition authority, the traditional competition authority, would probably decide that this is, at most a merger between companies at different levels, or even in different relevant markets. So maybe vertical, maybe conglomerate, but this would traditionally not be seen as problematic. This approach, the traditional approach, if you speak to the normal person on the street, not an expert, would say that this is a very narrow approach. It is very narrow. And to start with, Amazon is very big. Why should it become even bigger? So is there a problem with size? And this applies not just to Amazon, also to Microsoft, to Google, etc. And there's also a sense that Amazon could make rather than buy. And they have enormous resources. Why gobble up another firm? Why don't they invest? Society would be better off. Maybe not the shareholders of iRobot, but society would have multiple firms competing for this kind of products. And also, we know that Amazon is a gatekeeper. So with a very privileged position in the economy. And there is a flywheel theory of arm that would posit that Amazon market power grows with each acquisition because its ecosystem insulates it from competition. So the acquisition of an asset such as iRobot harms Amazon competitors, but ultimately also consumers potentially in each discrete business line that Amazon offers. So competition authorities are interested in this, but they need to prove that the post-merger there would be anti-competitive effects using specific evidence, not general theories. So today we ask three academics to tell us how they think about conglomerate mergers through the lenses of different fields, related fields, of course, where we have economics and traditional IO, that's going to be Patrick, but also strategy is going to be Annabelle, and also business administration is going to be Feng. So they're going to tell us how they think about this, and then the enforcers will react and tell us what they think about our research and what they think about this kind of mergers which are ongoing and they're really endemic. So before handing the baton to Cristina, two last things from me. First, disclosure. It's very important in general, but specifically when there is a lot of money at stake. And so I'm going to disclose that I'm not involved in any merger. And second, this webinar is open. It is being recorded, and it will be posted online. So keep this in mind. You can ask questions. There is a Q&A function that I will moderate during this remaining 1.5 hours that we have. So Cristina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tommaso, and a great welcome to everyone, and in particular to the panelists. I want to start with a disclosure. I mean, my disclosure is in full glory on the CEPR RPN website. For the purposes of this particular event, I will say that I've been advising Microsoft and the Activision matter. I want to motivate what we're doing a little bit. Tommaso has given a good overview, but clearly there is no question that the antitrust community collectively is confronted with this phenomenon of large digital platforms which have expanded from the core source of monetization into multiple directions. And we have the usual horizontal vertical approach in assessing mergers. Are they buying something equivalent? Are they buying a potential competitor? Are they buying an input? Are they buying a distribution channel? But is there more to it that we should be thinking about, which takes into account the particular circumstances, in particular, the broader set of assets that a company has developed over time, potentially accumulated presence in multiple markets, sheer size, financial resources, capitalization. So when we look at these deals through the traditional lens and we apply horizontal and vertical kind of tools, are we missing something quite fundamental here? And there is an anxiety that I absolutely see with regulators, because they are saying we don't want to be in a position where in 5 years we pass a merger and we're looking back and say, why did we miss that? How did we not see that happening? And particularly at times of acquisition that may enable in some way the shift to new paradigms, new form factors, immersive realities, and so on, it is important to be particularly vigilant. Now, briefly, the motivation, the title for this event comes out of a talk that Attorney General Cantor, Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Cantor gave at Fordham just over a month ago. He made a reference to the arcade game Whack-A-Mole. He was essentially thinking of the mole that comes out and you bat it back and more come at you, and essentially unless you unplug the machine, you're never able to win. But more relevantly, he said, I believe our horizontal and vertical frameworks has been limiting in this respect, focusing on that distinction as screened out important information about mergers that entrench market power and tend to create monopoly. Mergers may relate to adjacent market and can have effects without being strictly horizontal and vertical. Our tools, however, have not equipped us to analyze them flexibly and comprehensively. So I've asked the panelists, as Tommaso says, they are a wonderful combination of academics in different fields, to think about 3 or 4 particular questions, and then I'll leave the floor to them. The first one is really this. When we think about merger assessment, we have as ground rule that we intervene if there is some merger specificity to the concern. So either there is a set of assets that somehow elevates the particular product or service that is being acquired into something with more market power, or that particular product or service is somewhat the rising agent in a souffle of existing assets that gives them greater market power. So how do we show that a particular acquisition is going to create that enhanced power? Do we need to articulate a specific mechanism? As economists, we're trained to say yes, but many say we have a history of intervening in these kind of cases where we are worried about size and presence and we should dust it down. More generally, do we need to articulate a leveraging story? Because are you leveraging power from here to there? And indeed, Pierre Gibault, the chief economist of the Commission, has recently said, I don't know how some of these stories differ from vertical foreclosure. So these are the questions I would like the panelists to address in their own inimitable way. I want to start from Patrick Ray. I will introduce them as I go through. I mean, Patrick needs no introduction as the others too. Patrick is a giant in the IO field and has made some super important contribution over the years on so many things that one cannot mention, but certainly the way in which we currently in enforcement and IO think about foreclosure is something that Patrick has contributed to tremendously. So Patrick, what is your view?
Thank you very much, Cristina, for this excessively kind introduction. I would like to address 3 points. The first one, I will try to come back to Tommaso introduction on this current narrow or the traditional narrow approach to competition policy, market-based, and we need the need to broaden this. The second point I would like to discuss will be more specifically about entry, and finally, given the topic of the day, I will take advantage of this interesting forum to make some advertising for ongoing research projects on conglomerate mergers. So first point, we need to rethink competition policy and move from markets to ecosystem. As Tommaso mentioned, the traditional approach is to start with a market definition, which is based on demand or supply substitutability. The idea is to encourage competition between substitutes and encourage cooperation among complements. Problem with this is that the distinction between substitutes and complements becomes increasingly blurred. Some products can be complements for some users or some uses and substitute for others. In a paper with Jean Tirole, we among other things, we made the point that for the given product, as prices decrease, complements can become substitutes, and conversely, substitutes may well become complements. So this notion is really not enshrined in marble, as in stone. With a couple of papers with Zenger, we also show that in a context where you have firms offering a range of products and services, so the same goods or services can be complements for, say, one-stop shoppers or single homers in the context of online platforms, and the same goods may well be substitutes for multi-stop shoppers or multi-homers. This is not exactly new. The Howard Smith and three co-authors have a wonderful piece in the AER documenting these patterns in the context of the competition among supermarkets in the UK. And they found, for example, that the need to attract one-stop shoppers is really the key driver of competition in those markets. However, in the digital economy, these features are exacerbated by the huge number of goods and services that are being offered by the main platform, and by additional features such as network effects, multi-sidedness, economies of scale and scope, and so on. So this really calls for moving away from the narrow traditional market-based approach to a different paradigm focused on competition between ecosystems, characterized by large platforms and various forms of co-opetition between the platforms and third-party suppliers. Turning to my second point, so it's about entry. So how do you deal with those ecosystems? You may want to foster competition among them, so that may require policy intervention, for instance, in the form of interoperability or of protection of intermediaries. It may also require meeting the scope for external growth, except maybe when it comes to acquisitions that would enable large players to enter in each other's markets. Cristina asked whether we need a story, and I would say yes, but maybe the standard of proof may be adjusted based on past evidence. So if you have accumulated evidence that it's likely to go in one direction, then you may adjust the standard of proof accordingly. But it may also require paying more attention to protecting potential competition and entry, and that's the point I would like to focus upon now. There as well, the traditional view, according to which the best potential entrants are those that are that offer close substitutes, may need to be revisited. And to see why, consider the following stylized example. By the way, this is something that I've started exploring, still ongoing, and I would welcome any joint effort to explore this further. So it's a call for cooperation here, not competition, cooperation. So take a classic model of product differentiation, like the standard hoteling line. So you have, let's suppose that there is an incumbent firm initially enjoying a monopoly position located somewhere on this line. The usual analysis suggests that the best positioning strategy of a potential endpoint depends critically on the role of price competition. Specifically, if firms do compete in prices, as in the classic autonomy model, then the entrant does not wish to position itself too close to the incumbent, so as to soften competition. This is sometimes referred to as a judo strategy. By contrast, in the absence of price competition, so for example, in the context of competition among ad-based TV channels, the entrant instead has an incentive to position itself as close as possible to the incumbent, so as to eat as much as possible in the customer base of the incumbent. Now, in the digital economy, the prevalence of ad-based business models may suggest that therefore the best entrants are the ones that are closest. However, there is another feature which is important in digital economy, which is the role of network effects. So let's throw in the picture the possibility that consumers benefit from network effects, so that other things being equal, they prefer to join the firm with the largest customer base. Now, in this context, by positioning itself close to the incumbent, the entrant is pretty unlikely to attract new consumers. Because everyone is currently on the platform of the incumbent. If you offer a product that is very similar, it's going to be very difficult to overcome the inertia and the network effects from that will benefit the incumbent. By contrast, by positioning itself far away from the incumbent, the entrant can attract those consumers that will have a strong preferences for the particular variety that the entrant offers. And this in turn can help attracting additional consumers and start a snowballing effect. So the best entry strategy here consists in trying to target niche products or services that are very differentiated, very different from those offered by the incumbents, and possibly completely unrelated to those offered by the incumbent. So that suggests that when it comes to the analysis of entry and potential competition and so forth, there as well the specificities of the digital economy, and here the fact that you have very often multi-sidedness that generates this no price competition or goods being offered, services being offered for free in exchange for other revenue. On the one hand, and network effects. On the other hand, the combination of both may lead to to revise quite substantially the analysis of potential competition. Let me now turn to the third topic, which is more specifically about conglomerate mergers, the topic of the day. These comments will be based on ongoing research with the Zenger chain, where we, in a project where we try to highlight a possible competitive concern related to technical integration or commercial branding. Basic idea is very simple. Suppose that you have, let's say, two products, A and B, one of which, at least, and in one of those markets is somewhat concentrated. To fix idea, suppose that in market A there are two firms, A1, A2, whereas maybe there are plenty of firms in the other market, in market B. And suppose that the firm A1 merges with a B firm, so that also form a conglomerate that offers both A and B under the same. Now, by conglomerate here, I don't mean to imply that A and B are necessarily complements. What I mean is that they may have independent demand, but what I mean is that the same consumers are interested in buying A and B. And suppose further that in each market the various competitors offer perfect substitutes, but consumers may benefit from one-stop shopping, or some consumers may benefit from one-stop shopping. So, one-stop shopping may generate consumption synergies, and some consumers may appreciate it. So, the fact that you can buy A and B from the same supplier may provide some benefits to some of the consumers. In the absence of any technical integration or pure bundling, you still have competition on a standalone basis. And in that case, the merger will have no adverse impact. You still have strong in competition in each market on a standalone basis. So those consumers who are not interested in the one-stop shop benefits, so the multi-stop shoppers or the multi-homers, they can still mix and match and benefit from competitive prices on a standalone basis. The one-stop shoppers, the ones who benefit from those consumption synergies, may be charged for this. So the conglomerate may offer the bundle at a premium price. So because it does.
1 minute, Patrick.
Yes.
1 minute.
Yes, I'm perfectly on time for once. So the one-stop shoppers may be charged more because they benefit from those one-stop shop benefits, but by reading preference, that they are necessarily better off. The picture changes drastically if you allow the conglomerate to engage in pure bundling or technical integration, because now all of a sudden consumers have faced a reduced choice. Either they go for the bundle offered by the conglomerate, or they need to go to the alternative supplier in market A and combine this with the offerings of alternative B firms. And therefore, it creates a portfolio differentiation between the conglomerate on the one hand and the remaining supplier in market A. And that allows, that enables both firms to charge higher prices. Consumers, in that case, are harmed. Multi-homers are certainly harmed, and total consumer surplus can go down. So that certainly shows that if you have this kind of conglomerate mergers, at the very least, you need to pay attention to avoid degraded interoperability, avoid pure, any form of pure integration, be it technical or otherwise. This resonates with the idea, the paper by Susan Atte and Fiona Scott-Morton on the role of intermediaries that may facilitate multi-hobbing. That will go in the same direction. You need, at the very least, you need to ensure that you have conditions that ensure that consumers can still mix and match as easily as possible. And I stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And there were a number of questions I have for you, but I'll leave them to the end. Essentially, a key takeaway seems to me that you are saying in your recent research, technical bundling, in effect, a tie is problematic. How, and this is something we can discuss later, how is that different from the established intuition that if you have a mixed bundling scenario, that's more difficult to lead to exclusion because you can't commit, but you have a tie, and that makes technical bundling more of a commitment device ultimately to exclude. So that is an interesting angle that I think we should pursue in terms of thinking of actionable theories. Now, let me move on to the next speaker, who is Feng Zhu. Feng Zhu is a professor at Harvard Business School, and we thought, Tommaso and I, that it was useful and important in this discussion to bring in perspectives that are somewhat different. We heard Patrick, the IO perspective, the theory perspective, the discussion and Patrick was essentially saying we need to just embrace a view of ecosystem, not just markets. Now, the notion of ecosystem is something that in the business discussion is well established. It's been around for a long time, even though it has tended to refer to the constellation of companies that may be producing value together. The difference is now we're talking about ecosystems as a single firm with different activities. And so this is the particular version of ecosystem, which is of interest today to enforcers, because this is what they're facing. So, Feng, how do you think about this, and what insights do you have from your own work which is extensive in platform economics and generally from the business strategy literature? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristina and Tommaso, for having me here on the panel. Yeah, so indeed, right? So our understanding of platforms, even from the business strategy literature, has advanced significantly over the years, moving beyond basically just the acknowledgement that such markets often have network effects, right? And this is really kind of because of all the excellent work done by scholars like Annabelle, who is also on this panel, right, and other people. And my own research, right, in this literature is mostly focusing on essentially explaining like constraining factors that can help us understand essentially the difference in platform performance and market competition, right? Over the years, right, even based on our kind of a simple observation, we can see like some platforms are capturing lots of value, are doing extremely well, such as like Google, like Apple. But there are many other platforms which are still struggling with value capture, right? So look at like, for instance, Uber, right? Look at like a Groupon, for instance, and we all know that many platform startups, right, tend to fail, even after burning lots of money, right? So the idea is that it turns out that even from my own research, right, there are important kind of factors that constrain platforms' ability to scale up or capture lots of value. And these factors might be actually pro-competitive, right? But there are also factors, right, I mean, that can make these platforms more like a winner takes most, right? As a result, may actually make the market less competitive. So it's actually important for us to actually understand during any merger and acquisition case, how would that potential merger or acquisition affect all these constraining factors, right? And many of these constraining factors I studied related to network properties, right? So for instance, right, going beyond like, for instance, just the existence of network effects, today it's actually kind of increasing the case because all the products are internet enabled with all this IoT technology. You see network effects everywhere. But the strength of network effects can differ also considerably across different markets, right? Think of cases like, for instance, like as a home video game console market, right? So in my own research, I show that these markets, right, in these markets, actually hits are very important, right? So a few hits can really drive, right, kind of adoption of these platforms. So as a result, right, we often see like a multiple kind of giants competing or coexisting in the markets, including like a Microsoft, Xbox, PlayStation, or Nintendo, right? And presumably like a new entrant still would be possible if they could acquire enough hits to drive the market adoption. Another important feature of this market is the consumers tend to play like a limited number of video game titles associated with a particular console generation. But then if you look at like other markets, like streaming markets, right, also about video sharing, right? So like, I mean, look at the YouTube, you look at the TikTok, right? On these markets, right, because consumers tend to enjoy like hundreds of videos, right? And the need for variety is substantially greater than on the home video console market. So as a result, for these markets, like the markets tend to be a lot more concentrated, right? So the network effects are so different, and when you have a strong network effects, right, potentially like through the acquisition, if it can benefit the acquiring companies, like because it can gain additional installed base significantly, or it can benefit the target company because the acquiring company has some kind of a user base, can immediately like kind of generate a huge boost, right, in terms of the user base for the acquiring company, right? Combined with significant network effects, it could be a significant concern. And like other kind of network factors, such as like, for instance, like multi-homing, many scholars are already kind of pointed out that the tendency to multi-home is actually quite important, right? And but the multi-homing how it operates tend to be quite nuanced, right? So for instance, like Amazon could acquire some media companies in order to own exclusive IP, and Disney also has exclusive IP, Netflix has also exclusive IP because with all Netflix originals, and they could certainly sign exclusive deals with these media production companies, right? So on the kind of the content provider side or the content side, we see like more single homing as a result of probably more merge and acquisition. But the interesting thing is that because of this, the two markets, like on the content side and the user side, they are interdependent of each other, right? More single homing on one side of the market can actually lead to more multi-homing on the other side of the market, because the consumers are seeing like all these platforms are differentiated. They are more likely to sign up for multiple service providers. And as a result, this may actually kind of be making it more difficult for a single kind of a platform to dominate the market, because this is almost like a countervailing force, right? So for like an interesting kind of a personal experience is that after Disney left Netflix, right, saying that, okay, we're going to start our own streaming company, Disney Plus, and many people were concerned that, oh, okay, like how would this affect Netflix? But I did some quick survey of my friends, and it turns out that many of my friends decided to sign up for both Disney Plus and Netflix. Part of the reason is because they have differentiated content, right? So if on the content side they're differentiated, consumers are actually more likely to multi-home. Of course, right, during economic downturn, you have some budget constraints. Then this is where you started to say, okay, probably I want to single home and sign up for only one streaming platform. Then that puts them into a kind of a more competitive scenario, right? So as a result, I try to understand how it influences multi-homing. It's a kind of a nuance, right? So another factor I studied on my own research is, for instance, the clustering network structure of these platforms, right? Take like Uber as an example. I mean, Uber is really facilitating mostly just local matching, right? So I'm in Boston, right? As a Boston user of Uber, I care about the number of drivers in Boston. I probably don't care whether Uber is a monopoly or not in San Francisco, for instance. And of course, if I travel a lot, I probably care about Uber's market share somewhere else, but most people don't travel like that frequently. And if I'm the Uber driver, most likely I'm going to serve like a lot of local kind of users in Boston as well. I probably care about Uber's market share in Boston. But this situation, right, is very different for Airbnb, for instance, right? If I'm traveling outside Boston to another city, right? I mean, usually I care about the number of hosts on Airbnb outside Boston. And if I'm a host in Boston, right, for Airbnb, I care about the number of travelers from other cities. So this kind of a different kind of a clustering structure of the networks can actually generate different competitive dynamics, in the sense that, I mean, if you are all based on this local matching, then the entry barrier could be quite low, because a new kind of a entrant could just concentrate its effort on a local market and try to compete, right, against the Uber in a particular city. It doesn't have to like scale up everywhere. Versus like in the Airbnb case, you really need a bigger scale, right, a global scale to really compete against Airbnb. Now, this would also affect how we think about the kind of, for instance, merger expansion of platforms into different areas. In China, for instance, lots of e-commerce platforms started to, either through acquisition or investment or doing everything by themselves, try to say, okay, maybe through e-commerce, I want to expand into this local grocery kind of like a basically food delivery, right? In the sense that I deliver grocery products to customers. But this grocery business is not unlike e-commerce platforms. It's really about the local to local match. Essentially, you are matching local residents with local farmers, right, essentially, and try to source these products locally, right? With this localized network structures, as a result, the competition is extremely intense, because there are lots of startups, right, operating in this space as well. And in the end, right, even though if you look at these platforms like Alibaba, JD, they make profits from their e-commerce business, but they inevitably lose money in this kind of a basically grocery delivery business, because of this localized network structure, right? So this is also something to consider as we think about the kind of a platform expansion through kind of merger and acquisition, right? And another factor in my research talks about like a disintermediation, which is about, in the sense that all these big intermediaries, right, what they are doing is about facilitating the match, and but ultimately, like sometimes like these service providers and users can be connected through other channels, and they can be connected directly, right? So the question is, how do we kind of think about the impact of merger acquisition on the availability of these outside options of enabling disintermediation, right? So let me give you maybe a hypothetical.
1 minute, no more.
Okay, so hypothetical example, right? So for instance, like say that a food delivery company try to acquire this white label, like on-demand delivery company, right? And so restaurants, right, sometimes do not have to rely on food delivery companies like DoorDash or Uber Eats to deliver food. They could kind of basically work with all these white label, like on-demand, like delivery companies for food delivery. And then in that case, they could connect themselves directly to all these customers, right? But if kind of a food delivery company is getting rid of that option, right? I mean, so that would affect their ability to disintermediate, and this would also affect the platform's power in charging like commission fees, right? So the last one, like before I finish, is we need to really think about the future expansion opportunities, right? The term I used in my academic research is called network bridging, in the sense that just another hypothetical example, like if you have like lots of capability in AI already, data analytics already, right? Suddenly, like you suddenly acquired a map company that would actually allow you to expand into like a driverless car, right, industry, right? So I mean, and maybe your position is very powerful because you have all these core elements, right, in your kind of ecosystem. This would actually raise rivals' cost to compete significantly, right? So we also need to kind of be mindful about this future kind of a network bridging opportunities. Yeah, thank you so much, Cristina.
Thank you, Feng. I want to move to Annabelle. Annabelle, professor at the University of Surrey, many other affiliations, but of course well known for her work on digital platforms from the perspective, of course, of a business school professor. So again, the question is, we are looking at a particular problem. We're not looking at any form of conglomerate. We are looking at conglomerates that are effectively large platforms that have strayed outside of their core monetization. They're buying additional businesses. This is the exam question. How is a regulator going to take that beyond the standard tools? And what are the criteria that they should be using in vetting that beyond the standard theories? Because that is what everybody's grasping for. Have we got something to say that goes beyond the standard? And what is it? Is it they're just very big? There are network effects. I mean, we know there are network effects. That doesn't take us to an actionable standard. So, Annabelle, over to you.
Thank you, Cristina. Delighted to be here. So if the question is, in what way the acquisition by a digital platform is going to be problematic in a way that's different from a traditional merger. So when we say problematic, that means that we are observing an activity that is going to impair somehow the competitive process. And I think that I would like just to go back for a minute to describing in what way the competitive process is different in the case of digital platform and digital ecosystem than in traditional industry. So in traditional industries, the traditional economic model is going to look at firms selling goods or services to users, and is going to look in terms of possible harms to competition as to whether their, for example, in this case, acquisition is going to foreclose a particular market, or whether the company is going to be able to charge a monopoly price. These are the signals that are going to tell the regulator there's something potentially harmful here. Okay. In the case of platform-based competition, what we see is that the arena of competition, the arena of competition, and from the perspective of the firm, the strategic decisions are not made at the level of separate markets. Ecosystem competition is going to be characterized by a player, here's going to be the platform owner, that is going to optimize not at the level of the single market, but that is going to try to optimize its profits at the level of a constellation of activities. And it's going to sometimes choose one as a bottleneck and commoditize all the others. So you're going to have a portfolio of activities that are not going to be limited to one particular product market. Given that basically the unit of analysis in which the process of competition happens does not happen within a particular market, but within a constellation of markets, that should be the right level of analysis where the regulator is looking at potential harms. Now, what kind of harms can we talk about, right? We don't just want to talk about the usual kind of harms that could be addressed by existing regulation. So if we want to think about harm, let's say harm compared to what, right? When we talk about harm in the traditional competitive process, we say harm compared to how a good competitive process naturally happens, where the consumers get as much benefit as possible for as little price as possible. And the process of competition weeds out all the unproductive and inefficient players, okay? I think what we need to be more precise about is, what is an ideal objective? What does that mean, ecosystem competition working well, when we're talking about digital platforms and ecosystems? And I think here we have to add one ingredient to what we normally expect firms to do when they behave well, right? When a traditional firm behaves well, according to the way competition should happen, we know what they're doing. They're buying, they're selling, they're optimizing, they're being as efficient as possible, and they price in the right way. But digital platform firms, in addition to that, they also govern a group of firms. They actually have a governance role, which is inseparable from their more traditional platform competition, traditional competition firm. So that leads me to say, okay, so what would be an ecosystem effect here that we need to talk about? We cannot separate a negative ecosystem effect from characterizing what would be a positive ecosystem effect, okay? So the positive ecosystem effect, which some of these platforms talk about a lot to justify their own behavior, is that they are able to identify complementarities and exploit complementarities using, in particular, data, right? So that they are basically tapping into sources of efficiencies by going across particular sectors. And I think that's a very valid argument. Now, if we look at the negative effect that can come from those acquisitions, I think we can think of a type of foreclosure effect, which is that because of their action, and here I'm going to be a bit more specific about it, they're going to make more difficult the engagement of other firms in these markets. But I think we need to talk about more than just entry in these markets. And here is where I would like to present a slide to you. So I'm going to share a slide. Here. Do you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So this is a slide from a recent paper which I've published called Digital Platform Boundaries, the interplay of firm scope, platform size, and digital interfaces. And here I'm presenting an example of how the choice of the scope of the firm, which is what we usually look at when we look at merger and acquisition, in the case of digital platforms, is interdependent with two other choices. One has to do with the configuration of their platform size, that is, which company or which actor they're allowed to be part of their sites. That's the second type of boundary. And the third type of boundary is the design of the digital interface that connects those actors to the firm. And here the choice is about the direction of data and how much data is being shared between these actors and the platform. And just to give an example that many people are familiar with, when Facebook acquired Instagram, right, what we see there is not only the expansion of the scope of the firm. Of course, we see that one firm acquires another. But what also happens if you look at the sides of these firms is that the Instagram user sides and advertiser sides got eventually merged with the Facebook user sides and the Facebook advertiser sides. And that despite Facebook original promises, a few years after the acquisition, the digital interfaces also got merged, okay? And the reason why I think that matters to regulator is that I think that the way those companies act is not only about changing the scope of the firm, but in a bundle of actions, looking at the scope of the firm, the configuration of the site, and their interfaces. And therefore, I think, whereas in the early days of market life, if you wish, we tend to see platforms starting with a narrow scope, starting with open interfaces, and aiming to add members to their sites. Once they move to a position of dominance, we tend to see them closing or recalibrating their interfaces, as well as expanding the scope. So, and I will finish here, but I think what I want to, the point that I want to make is that for regulators to really be able to examine the positive and the negative effect of these mergers and acquisitions in these settings, they need to look jointly at the conduct of those platform firms, not only in how they expand the scope of their firm, but what they do to their interfaces, as well as which company do they allow or not allow in their platform sites. And I will stop my remarks here.
Thank you. You wouldn't be a business school professor if you didn't have slides. So let me move on to the regulator's side. I want to bring in Mike first. Mike, of course, chief economist of the CMA, progressive and forward-looking agency, which has distinguished itself over time for quite innovative approaches. And of course, the academics have given different perspectives, but you are at the coalface, having to make decisions and judgments about actual deals where you are having to think, what am I doing which is not in the horizontal box or the vertical box? Have I got anything to work with? Do I need to elaborate or articulate a mechanism that will stand up? What is the standard of evidence? How are you thinking of this on an everyday basis? Oops, we can't hear you, Mike. You're not on mute, but we can't hear you. Maybe disconnect the, yeah, sometimes that works.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I wasn't on mute and headphones, just on the whole computer. Sorry about that. So I'll just start off with a quick caveat. Obviously, this is me speaking, not the CMA, but I'm not going to say anything controversial, so that's not really an issue. I just want to pick up a couple of things that's already been talked about before I come to my remarks. First thing is, I mean, Tommaso started off by outlining this scenario whereby, you know, we've got this merger, unrelated products, so they're in different markets, so you know, authorities aren't going to have a problem with that. I mean, yeah, obviously you're setting up a store man there. I mean, I think this just highlights how dangerous market definition often is. You know, I mean, Joe Farrell recently made what I think is a really good comment when he said you should only do market definition when it's really easy, and when it's not easy, you should just get on and do the competitive effects analysis. And I think that's absolutely right. And that's obviously reflected in our merger assessment guidelines, where we put market definition right at the back. That's the reason for that. I also want to pick up on a point that Patrick made about, you know, this horizontal vertical distinction or substitute conglomerates, you know, again, how that might get in the way. You know, I mean, I think it's similar. It's a really useful framework for thinking about issues. You know, clearly horizontal merger, fine. It's clearly vertical merger, fine. Different frameworks, but they're not constraining frameworks. You know, and if there's any doubt as to exactly how you should be thinking about the merger, is it horizontal or vertical, just ignore that and get on and do the competitive effects. And we do have parties in some cases saying to us, well, look, make up your mind. Is it horizontal? Is it vertical? But the answer is no, focus on the competitive effects. And I think it's really important to get away from these labels. You know, I think some of these labels really get in the way. I also want to say something about what Annabelle said, but actually I'll come to that a bit later. If we deal with, you know, the issue here around ecosystem theories of harm, I mean, my concern as an enforcer is all about creating barriers to entry and raising rivals' costs. You know, that's what I care about, and so that's the framework within which I'm going to be operating in most of these cases. Is, does this raise entry barriers, or does this raise rivals' costs? And in particular, does this raise barriers to innovative entry? Because it's innovation that I'm really going to care about. You know, this, and actually this seems to me, you know, a pretty standard concern. It's not a new concern. The idea that, you know, you can have, I mean, the Microsoft cases back in the 1990s, we talk about the application barriers to entry. That's all about creating an ecosystem that makes entry harder. So I don't think it's a new issue. It just is a bigger issue. because it comes up in more areas, and it comes up in areas that are completely pervasive of how we now live. So, it's a very important issue, not a new one, but we are increasingly thinking about these in cases because it has become more important. And I'm less concerned about some of these leveraging market power type theories, because ultimately I still think they come down to raising rival cost type theories. So I think I'm in Pierre Regibu's camp on that one, not a comment I often make, but I think I am there. So why might some of this stuff be controversial? Well, I'm often accused of supporting efficiency offenses, and obviously when conglomerate power, portfolio power, these issues started, I am on record as saying that they were intellectually bankrupt and there's no coherence to them, but that was 25 years ago. I was young and stupid. I think now we have to actually accept that efficiency offense type arguments, they are economically coherent. Okay. Now, on the facts, they may well not hold, but they are economically coherent. And actually, for most of them, it means that the short run efficiencies are, essential to the long run theory of harm. That's a super uncomfortable position for a competition authority to be in. We never want to be in that position, but unfortunately, we don't get to make the world. So we are in that position frequently, and we have to accept that and make decisions on that basis. And I think that's very difficult. It is very difficult. However, when things are difficult, the answer isn't to say, "Oh, this is really difficult. Let's do nothing." We'll just allow all these mergers to go ahead, as if by doing that we avoid making a difficult decision. You still made a decision. It's a decision to do nothing, and that might well be a bad decision. So I think it all comes back to the need to take dynamic competition seriously. We know it's innovation that drives economic growth. It's not price effects. So we need to be very concerned about future effects on innovation. Okay, and my reading of the economic literature, and I suspect also of quite a lot of the business school literature, is that actually it's competition that typically drives innovation. And if you want disruptive innovation, it's going to come from outside of the incumbents. And I think that's, we need to make sure we protect disruptive innovation. And if we go to Annabelle's point, really important point, I think, about this, the governance aspect of some of these platforms. If ecosystem mergers allow the incumbents to limit the path of future innovation, then that's really bad news. And if we're concerned about that, I think we should tend to take a position against ecosystem mergers. So now, obviously, these are uncertain judgments, but that governance point, I think, is very important. Now, I think it's also a point that Annabelle made. We are talking about concerns around big digital platforms, and it's important that we don't see these ecosystem theories of harm whenever we see an ecosystem. And I think Feng made that point really well. There's a bunch of ecosystems where really, there aren't market power concerns, and it's important that we don't start to manufacture ecosystem theory of harm because they've become, very popular. Okay, I think I've got 1 more minute. So, given, and I'm going to reiterate, this is not CMA, I'm not the CMA speaking here, it's just my personal opinion. Given that I think it's entry and innovation that really matters, given that I think entry to compete against the large platforms' core products is already extremely difficult, I am worried by anything that is going to make that sort of entry harder. And so I think that in some of the large platforms, ecosystem mergers, I think the bar to allowing those should be quite high, particularly if they involve data advantages that those platforms are able to keep themselves and not share. And at that point, I will stop. Thank you.
Excellent. Let me move on to John next. I'm glad you managed to join. Mike, a number of key points, barriers to entry dynamics. We were all young and stupid when we were complaining about efficiency offense. I was there with you, and I certainly do at the time recognize youth and stupidity. But I also heard you saying that you think about this mostly as, in many ways, as theories of leveraging, raising rivals costs, but there is a broader setting where entry and advantage can be effectively exploited. Now, John, Mike comes from, in some way, the advantageous position in the UK, where we don't have to define market in a way that is religious, and we don't have to be particularly specific about whether something is horizontal and vertical. I know that there is a plan and there is underway a revision of the guidelines in the US, but so far one feels that that has been a liberty that you haven't had. That said, what is your take on all of this, and give us your views?
Well, first off, I'll add the same caveat that these are my personal views, of course, not those of the FTC or the Bureau of Competition. I'd like to pick up, if I could, and I might just steal, if I could, with attribution, of course, Mike's comment that we don't get to make the world. That's very true of the US situation, just as it is around the world. And Cristina, to your question just now, I think in the US context are somewhat more constrained by certain Supreme Court precedent that requires market definitions in merger cases. That said, I think there's still a good amount of leeway, a good amount of law yet to be developed on this point. How precise does the market have to be defined? Is that a sliding scale? Should it change based on the type of theory of harm? I think those are more open questions. So there's still some freedom, even though we don't get to make the world. I guess I was struck sitting here as a sometime academic, now enforcer, by the reality that as enforcers, we are operating in these mergers, particularly, I think, under conditions of less than perfect information, right? Especially compared to a sort of standard 3-to-2 horizontal merger. We're just not going to have as much information. We're not going to have as much certainty in general around these mergers and exactly how they might end up harming competition or harming trading partners or consumers, et cetera. So that's for a variety of reasons. I think the markets themselves are not immediately obvious in the way that they often are in a horizontal context. You can just see what the market is right away. Here, it's not always immediately obvious what the relevant market is. The markets tend to be in motion, going to, I think, a couple of points we've heard around innovation being important. And I think companies themselves, when they're doing these deals, oftentimes don't know exactly why they're doing the deal. They may have a variety of possible mechanisms in mind when they enter into one of these transactions. These ecosystems, I think we could all probably agree, do lend themselves to multiple possible avenues for harm, right? If you control a lot of different levers, that changes your ability as a company. And so, just breaking this up, if I could, into liability and remedy, two questions we have to think about as enforcers. I think, Cristina, your questions at the outset are exactly the right ones on liability. How do we tell whether this deal is going to supercharge the target or the acquirer? I think that leads right into the next question of, do we need to say a specific mechanism for that? Practically speaking, I think the answer is yes, with the caveat that that doesn't mean we have to articulate it exactly perfectly in a pristine manner every time. But I do think we're going to need to tell a story to a judge at the end of the day. Now, I think listening to a lot of the questions posed by the academics on the panel, I think solidified my thinking around the idea that we should strive, I think, for an objective approach, as objective as possible. That is, we focus on capabilities. How many levers do you wield? Not necessarily internal company preferences or desires or even intent so much. There's this great FTC case from 1961 where the commission said it's not the exercise of the power that counts, it's the power itself. I think that's a good first principle for these acquisitions. I think we're thinking about things like reviving what's often called actual potential competition theory in the US. I think that, if an acquirer operates a large ecosystem, I'm just speaking hypothetically here, but if an acquirer operates a large ecosystem, oftentimes there is a non-zero chance that acquirer has the capability of building whatever it's about to buy instead of buying. Some more good economics from a lawyer. I'm, of course, a little biased as a lawyer, but more good economics from a 1960 lawyer, a judge. Well, the Supreme Court in the US said internal expansion is more likely to provide increased investment, more jobs, and greater output. I tend to think that's right at a high level. And so if we're thinking about this build versus buy choice, and oftentimes these companies have the capability of building, I think that theory offers a lot of potential utility to enforcers. A lot of work for academics to be done, I think, explaining contours of the theory. What are the right standards? What quantum of evidence should enforcers be looking for? But the theory itself potentially useful. I also think getting to an approach where we're not looking for, again, precise, pristine theories of exactly what's going to happen, but instead a kind of set of plus factors may be useful. So I'm, thinking of things like whether the acquisition target is a market leader. Presence of network effects came up. I think just about every speaker mentioned network effects naturally. That could be a plus factor. Does the acquirer have a monopoly position? Building on something Feng mentioned, I think he used the phrase future network capabilities. I kind of think about is the underlying technology in a state of flux at this moment? If so, I think that heightens the kinds of concerns that Mike mentioned around innovation, making sure that entry is easier. So you might think about the shift from desktop to mobile earlier this century as a time when the underlying technology was in flux. That made it all the more important for regulators to make sure innovation is, that the runway for innovation is clear. Data advantages, I think Mike mentioned right at the end of his remarks, that might be another plus factor. Is there some kind of unique data advantage given to the acquirer by this transaction? But that's all on liability. If I have a minute left, Cristina hasn't given me the warning sign yet. I would like to talk a bit about remedies. We've been talking a lot, I think exclusively, about the question of liability. Is a merger illegal or not? Perhaps the most marked shift in my thinking brought on by my turn as an enforcer has been thinking about remedy from day one. I don't have the luxury of really totally separating the two questions because it's only worth deploying our scarce resources if a meaningful remedy can be had. And I want to get back to that visualization of someone who can wield a lot of different levers as ways to harm rivals, as ways to block innovation, et cetera. Those multiple leverage points, especially in a context where regulators don't have perfect information about exactly which lever might be pulled, I think militates extremely strongly in favor of structural remedies. Block the deal rather than a behavioral remedy that tries to identify which levers will be pulled and tries to sort of tie the acquirer's hands. Oftentimes, I think there's just going to be too many potential avenues, and we're just not going to know for sure which ones need to be tied up. Getting back to the idea that internal expansion will oftentimes create more innovation, more jobs, more output. I think, again, block the deal if it's justified on the facts, of course. But I think there should be, again, a very strong presumption on the part of enforcers in favor of a structural remedy. And with that, I will close out. Thank you.
Wow, John, that's great. I want to also pick up on some of what you said in multiple ways. Again, we'll leave it after Hans, but what strikes me is this idea that you have of the multiple levers. Okay, so the capabilities there. But what you're going to be confronted with is essentially a pushback that says, but what exactly is the lever that is going to raise the cake? And how is that going to be used? And that is the sense in which the debate is between a vision that says, of course, we think that capabilities is what matters, and another that says, no, you need to show me a mechanism through which that is going to sort of occur. Not very precise, perhaps, but still a mechanism. Is it bundling? Is it raising rivals' cost? Is it some form of tie? Is it some sort of price discrimination? What is the story? And you yourself say, we will need something to go in front of a judge. Let me go to Hans before reopening the general discussion. Hans, of course, you patiently waited, but I'm really keen to hear how you come at this and what you think.
Thanks very much, Cristina. So I have the same disclaimer as the other speakers before, speaking for myself. Now, I want to start off by perhaps reacting to one very important thing that Mike has mentioned, and that's the issue of efficiency offenses, because of course that's something that's raised a lot in this debate, harking back to the old portfolio type theory. I think, obviously a competition authority should only prohibit conduct that will harm competition, and obviously lots of complementary mergers in the tech space have brought enormous efficiency. So let's just get this out of the way before going into the theories. But I think it's important to remember, and that goes back to what Mike said, that most of the theories that we have in the economic literature about dynamic effects, they start off with something which is a short-term benefit. So if you think of Carlton Waldman or whatever, there's usually some small benefit in the beginning, followed by a very large negative. And that's, I think, our burden to prove in the end. But it's not just because there's some small benefit in the beginning that it's necessarily an efficiency offense. Now, as other speakers have said here, and I think I will shorten a lot sort of what I was planning to say, given that a lot has been said. I mean, obviously, in these portfolio theories, it's about a dynamic, forward-looking exercise. It's not the old sort of portfolio strength of, let's say Guinness Grand Metropolitan, where it's about beer and a larger portfolio of beer. That can create 10 cents of harm for the beer drinker. It's more about the NVIDIA ARM type of dynamic foreclosure theory and how different markets are linked. And so at the essence, it's about denying entry points for rivals, both at the core of an activity and at the periphery, and to create some impermeability of the position of the firm across markets. So if you will, I would say it's a foreclosure plus, if you will. There's often an element of foreclosure as a basis, but usually laced with other issues like potential competition, innovation competition, entry deterrence, two-sided foreclosure. So at the heart of it, it's a horizontal theory, not a vertical theory, even though it has vertical elements. Now, how should we look at these things? I think if we look in the future, and I think, Feng has mentioned this, John has mentioned this as well, we can't look at products, we have to look at capabilities, at firms' abilities in a developing space. And, as Cristina has mentioned, this is something that's quite natural in the business research community. However, there are recent advances that are, a small literature that's growing on capabilities in network economics. I'm thinking of papers like, Matthew Elliott from Cambridge has started to produce some research about ecosystems and capabilities, and I think that's very relevant. And if you look at this in an applied space, the basic point you can go back to is things like innovation competition. So probably cases like Dow DuPont, where we look not at the product market overlaps, but about the basic capabilities of firms in entering into new markets and competing in that space. But I think this concept of scarce capabilities that are added by merger, has much broader applicability than just innovation competition. It goes to potential competition, and it goes to additional leverage possibilities, things like the kill zone. So I think that lens of capabilities and scarce capabilities is a very useful one. A second thing that I want to mention is, and that's something that Annabelle has also raised, is that, of course, once we're thinking about the future, we'll have to think about counterfactuals differently than we do normally in competition policy. We cannot look at the past, we have to look at the future. So we have to think about what will this merger mean in the future, not only for the merging parties, but also what would have happened for other people if this merger had not been there. Now, one thing that was mentioned already is the make or buy decision. I think John mentioned it. And I think many firms are still submitting us these documents where they say, for us, it's make or buy, as though it was an absolutely innocent thing. In many situations, it may not be an innocent thing if you're combining some really scarce capabilities, because then issues of potential competition can arise. A case that the commission brought, I could point to, is Deutsche Börse LSE, where this was a big topic, of two firms basically having platforms that, where each was probably, the most promising entrant for the other. Another example would be platform annexation. It was mentioned, I think, by Patrick before, the paper by Fiona and Scott Morton and Susan Athey, where you buy a scarce capability, not because you want it yourself, not you want to make your own product better, but you want to avoid that that firm makes other people better. For instance, by helping multi-homing. You know, a case that's often mentioned here is Google DoubleClick. You know, that had some of those characteristics in people's minds. Now, the most extreme example of this, I think, would be a preemptive merger, where you buy something not because you want it yourself and it doesn't help yourself, but you buy it in order to prevent that somebody else buys it and takes it as a useful tool. Now, of course, in business, this notion of a preemptive merger, I mean, is a very standard notion, and we see it in internal documents. But in competition law, I think it's underused. We have some cases. So, I mean, the issue was raised, for instance, in the Knorr-Bremse-Haldex merger, which was abandoned ultimately, where there had been concerns that Haldex might have been purchased in order to prevent other people from using it as a springboard to increase competition. Now, of course, in all of this, I think we have to have a different understanding of efficiencies. It's not only about efficiencies in terms of weighing harms versus efficiencies, but we have to understand the efficiencies, because we have to understand which efficiencies might a non-merger bring to third parties in the market. So we have to think about the business models and the efficiencies in a much more proactive way, I think, in order to understand and develop good theories of harm. Now, finally on this, I want to mention, I think in this literature, often it is being said that, combining scarce capabilities, of course, that's a kind of a horizontal overlap in dynamics. But I want to point out that it's very important to think also that it's not only the substitutable, it's often said that combining substitutable capabilities is a problem, but also combining complementary scarce capabilities can be a great problem. I will give as an example a hypothetical. Just imagine 30 years ago, you would have had a merger between Microsoft and Intel. So Microsoft at the height of its power in operating systems, Intel at the height of its power in CPUs. Now, this would be very hard to bring sort of with the standard merger guidelines. You would say, well, they're not actual competitors. They're also not potential competitors because they have, their capabilities of scarce, but they're very different. And foreclosure, well, there's really nobody to foreclose to raise rivals' costs. So, the parties would have argued, well, there's a lot of EDM and a lot of technological integration. It's a great merger. Is it great? Well, I would argue it would not be great, because if you think about it, who is the company with the most interest in there being competition for Intel? It's Microsoft. And who is the company with the most interest in competition for Microsoft? It's Intel. So such mergers can lead to two things. First of all, if the two firms go together, a potential entrant all of a sudden has to innovate in two markets in order to be able to enter and compete, which makes it much harder. And second of all, you also lose the sponsor that would help you create an ecosystem with them, because they benefit from more competition in the complementary market. So I think that's why we have to think about capabilities not only in a substitutable, but also in a complementary way. Do I still have a minute, Cristina?
Yes, go ahead.
Very good, excellent. That's great. So then I can still say something about the standard of proof and the mechanism and so forth. And I think, obviously, I think we cannot just say advantage. It's there are too many efficiencies around. We have to show competitive harm, and but I think the standard clearly, should be linked to the expected cost that you see. And so what does that mean? Well, I want to give you an example from foreclosure. When you ask economists about ability and incentive to foreclose, then very often the economists will say, it's the same thing. I just write up an incentive formula, and it's more or less that will tell me then, what's the benefit, what's the cost, and then at the end of the day, the equation will tell me, what the problem is or is not, and then we have a solution. Now, from an academic perspective, that may make a lot of sense, but I think, as John has emphasized, in the real world, you have a lot of uncertainty. Now, let's imagine, Patrick writes me a wonderful submission in a case, and will say, let's say this particular merger, there is the cost of foreclosure is 100 and the benefit is 95, so you should clear. Well, should I always take this at face value? I would say it depends a lot on the ability. So if you have some merger where maybe, you know, like the Guinness Grand Metropolitan that I was mentioning at the beginning, where the risk of getting it wrong is that beer prices are 5 cents higher, you know, then maybe I should be very precise, and, you know, it's, you know, the burden of proof is on me. If on the other hand I have something like NVIDIA ARM, where, you know, when you get it wrong, all of a sudden you have potentially a messed up situation in, you know, the vast majority of chips that people use in modern life, you know, then you have a very, very different risk. So, you know, I would agree with John there. It's not only about the incentive, it's also about the ability. And the higher the ability is, you know, that should factor into what evidence an authority needs to show to discharge its burden of proof or its standard of proof. And, you know, what you could apply there is a bit, you know, what you could call the list trust rule. You know, you should wonder, I know, what's the worst that could possibly happen? And that'll be my comments. Thank you.
This is a real winner. That's wonderful. So, I mean, a lot of fantastic material there, from Foreclosure Plus to your view on foreclosure standard, and I want to though give the word back to the academics just in the last few minutes, just because we heard so much from all of you. But of course, the enforcers have put a very concrete, very real perspective, which is, I think, should be transcribed, made obligatory reading to all advisors out there in the city and elsewhere, because I don't think people have the faintest idea of what's before them. So let me ask Patrick, Feng, and Annabelle whether you have any comments on what you heard, any observations, any further final comments that you'd like to leave us with. Patrick?
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you all for your comments and remarks. This is exactly why this kind of initiative is really important. It's important for us academics, clearly. I hope it's useful on the other side as well, but you know, it's very well done. 2.5 points. The dynamic innovation, I agree, this is really key. I have this paper with Marie-Laure Alain and Claire Chambol on, it's not on conglomerate mergers, that's why I did not mention it before. It's on vertical mergers. It's the idea that it's vertical mergers and hold-up problems, hold-up concerns. It's it was well known in the literature that vertical mergers can be a solution to the hold-up problems. Hold-up problem is that you innovate and then your partner will hold you up and ask for a bigger share of the pie, and that discourages this anticipating this innovation is discouraged. You put the two partners under the same roof, vertical merger, problem solved. In this paper we emphasize that it may be a solution for the merging parties, but that it may well create or exacerbate hold-up concerns for the rivals. So that indeed, when you have, it was prompted initially by the GPS saga. So when Garmin, the main challenger of TomTom in the GPS handheld devices, was telling that Garmin is going to be integrated with one of the two providers of digital maps. Whenever I come up with an idea for an innovation, I need to go to the map provider in order to implement it and tell what the innovation is about and so on. Now that the map provider is vertically integrated with my direct rival, clearly I cannot do that anymore. It's impossible. They would manage to implement innovation before I get it to market. And this puts me in the hands of the remaining alternative provider that is going to discourage innovation and so forth. So we developed from a model that indeed captures this intuition and confirms this intuition. I would expect it to be transposable in the context of conglomerate mergers, where you have different components in the system, and if you have some integration among component providers, the incentive to help support innovations from other component providers, rival component providers, is probably going to be significantly affected. So I think that may provide some analytical framework for the kind of concern that was raised by several of you. On capability, I understand. I fully agree that capability matters, and the more capability you have, the more levels you have. The concern, the risk is. But I would not necessarily, eliminate the need for having a story. In particular, if the reason why we want to be tough is based on the presumption has to be based on past experience. So Hans said, we should not look at the past, we should look at the future, but we can look at the past, saying how was the future looking back then and so on, and if we have taken another decision and so forth. And at the very least, I think that if there is a presumption, it must be because we have seen in the past that bad things happen time and time again. So we should have an idea of the kind of story that is likely to occur. So I believe I would maintain some need for a story, but of course, the burden of proof, the standard of proof can be adjusted, and if the risks, on the bad side are really terrible, that is also that will affect the expectations. I'm not against introducing some dose of risk aversion. Maybe Hans' suggestion was a bit extreme, but I'm certainly open to kind of precautionary principle, transposing in competition. Hans, on the last scenario that you mentioned, I think your paper by Choi and Stefanidis was precisely capturing this, the fact that if you need to innovate in both markets, it's going to be more difficult. So, but it's there is a useful reference. I shall that.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Feng, 2 minutes. No more?
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I really loved the discussion around the capabilities, just like what Patrick said. And I completely agree that as companies are having a bigger ecosystem, then there are multiple levers you could pull. And just to kind of build on the kind of point that Patrick just mentioned, that it might still be useful kind of to have a story, right? Telling like people like how exactly these different levers may create some kind of a competitive advantage or raise rivals' cost. I think one way to think about it is to apply some of the thinkings like in the business literature called the first principle thinking, in the sense that if you look at a particular industry, given the industry, you could always ask yourself, like, what are the fundamental forces that drives competitive advantage in an industry? These fundamental forces tend to kind of be quite stable, right? So for instance, in the retail industry, it's all about like a cost, efficiency, variety, customer experience, right? In the retail industry, right? So you could ask yourself, like, okay, given all these capabilities, how do you drive like a gain competitive advantage in these fundamental forces, right? And even if, like, for instance, we don't know the right business models for driverless vehicles, for instance, right? But we could also imagine that we're in the driverless world. What would be the fundamental driving forces, right, in that world, right? So it's going to be like most like a customer experience, when they're in the car, like the variety of content being delivered through the car, the cost of using these vehicles, right? All these factors, right, could also drive our thinking about like, for instance, like how companies can kind of gain competitive advantage in kind of gaining their ability to deliver this content, and also how fast the content can be delivered, all these things, right? So there could be like some first principle thinking that can help us like build basically reasonable stories to argue whether this is triggering some competitive concerns or not, right? And also related to that is also the idea that, okay, you're acquiring different data sets when you do the merger and acquisition. And even though like sometimes it's actually very difficult to accurately measure the additional gain from this data, there are actually some useful frameworks we could think about. Okay, when you combine these kind of different data sets together, like how much additional value you could get, right, out of this combined data set, in thinking about, for instance, whether there are reasonable substitutes for similar data set, and how fast this data may perish, right, over time, and how much like this data is enabling learning about the individual user or learning across users, which may generate a greater kind of impact or lock-in for the whole network, right? So there are some useful frameworks at least can help us kind of understand like the value of gaining additional data, right? Similarly about the value of gaining additional users, etc.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Last word to Annabelle. Please take us away, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, so I'll make it very short. I thought it was incredibly valuable to hear from the enforcers and, for example, Mike's point about how he simplified, that the question about harms. We don't have to try to find entirely new types of harms, raising rival costs and raising barriers to entry. This is the harms that we're looking at. I thought it was very insightful to remind us of the applications barrier to entry with Microsoft. Another point which I think is really important is the one I've heard about dynamic competition and the future, and therefore, in particular, whether an acquisition is going to limit the path of future innovation. So I think for us, academic, there is an important area of work to do here, which is how can we find ways to get better at answering this question? How can we tell whether an acquisition will indeed limit the path of future innovation? And I'd like to finish on perhaps a provocative note, which often people say, innovation is a necessity is the mother of invention. And what seems to be preventing something from happening sometimes, opens up new doors. So I'm not sure we do have today the capabilities to really predict what could limit the path for future innovation. But we have one dimension which has to do with opening up interfaces, making sure that multi-homing is possible, multi-homing that interoperability is possible. That I think at least one first way in which we can make sure that potential third-party innovators can access some resources. But I think we can probably do better than that in the future.
So we are at time. I will hand over to Tommaso to wrap up finally, but let me on my own behalf thank you all. I think this was an incredible discussion, and I think it is exactly an illustration of why we have RPN, because these discussions don't happen often. The regulators and the enforcers having absolutely the ability to lay out there what it is that they're confronted with and how they're thinking about things, and academics trying to take it on board. So this is the nature of the discussion we want to facilitate, and we're going to be writing this up, I'm sure, in the coming days. Thank you all from my side hugely. I thought it was very insightful. Tommaso, over to you.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you, everybody. It was a very refreshing discussion. There is lots of ideas, I'm sure, that many of you had. I will just conclude by saying thanks again. I will also put in a plug for the CEPR RPN on competition policy. If you just look for CEPR RPN on competition policy, you will find the web page of the RPN. We will put there also the recording of this event. If you go back, we did one on inflation and corporate greed back in July that generated lots of interest. Before that, on electronic platform, on privacy. And given that there is a lot of response from you guys in the audience, I think I can just say watch this space for the next one. Thanks again for being with us.
Thanks again, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.